Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
What if I told you that everything my parents believed about me was a lie, and the person who fed them that lie wore the title of responsible daughter like a name tag, while I learned to keep breathing without an audience? And are you ready for a shocking truth? Because my father once chose the easiest story he could find and told me to leave my own home as if it were a favor, and I said nothing because I knew the only way to survive a setup is to stop performing and start documenting. I will not pretend I handled it gracefully, because that first night my hands shook in a way that made simple things feel complicated. Yet, even while I was packing a small duffel with the kind of efficiency you learn only when you realize debate is pointless, I heard my sister's voice floating down the hall in that painfully gentle tone people use when they want to look kind while twisting the knife, telling my mother that she had found a bag of bottles in my room and that I needed help before I ruined the family for good. My mother stared at me as if she were looking through me toward the version of me Aaron had already painted, and my father did his fixer routine where he frames cruelty as rescue, saying I could either take a break somewhere else and get myself together, or he would call someone who would get my attention in a way I would not like. And I remember thinking that it is amazing how fast love turns into policy when appearances are on the line. I will not dress this up. My room had no mystery bag, and the labels on the bottles Erin waved around had my name printed in a font I had never seen from my clinic. And when I asked where she got them, she sighed in that righteous way and said she wished I would stop making this harder, which is the kind of line you can only deliver if the audience has already decided you are the problem. And in that moment, I learned a lesson you usually pay for in installments, which is that proof matters only to people who want it. I could have thrown a scene and torn open every drawer to show the absence of evidence, yet I realized that evidence is boring until it is organized, so I kept my voice steady, asked for one day to straighten my things, and watched my father's eyes harden the way they do when he thinks he is being manipulated, which hurt more than I will admit because I never manipulated anyone. I simply assumed my parents knew me better than a speech delivered by my sister in their kitchen. I left that night with a cheap rideshare to a sublet my coworker's cousin offered for a month, and the couch smelled like old takeout, which would have been funny if my life did not feel like it had been stolen and resold while I was still in the room. And I sat with my phone and made the first move that would become a pattern, because I called my clinic and asked for a complete prescription history mailed to my email and physical address. Then I placed an identity fraud alert with a credit bureau, and then I froze my insurance profile because I did not know yet how my name had been used, only that someone was already using it. The silence that followed felt almost peaceful, not because I was okay, but because there was finally no one to win over with my tone, and when the quiet got too loud I opened a blank document and wrote down a list that looked simple, which was the point. Because complicated plans are for people with an audience, and I had chosen to live without one for a while. The next morning I walked into work and told my manager I needed every drug screening result on file printed and signed. No explanation, and he looked at me for a long second and said he trusted me, which did not fix the hole in my chest, but did put something on the other side of it, and I put the packet in a folder labeled boring things, because I wanted it to be easy to hand to anyone who asked. When my mother texted to ask if I had slept somewhere safe, I answered with a simple yes followed by I am working, and when she replied with a paragraph about family and support and how I should be open to help, I put my phone face down because I knew what that really meant, which was accept the role Aaron wrote for you, and we will all be fine again. I ordered a new debit card, switched banks, reset passwords, and told my boss I would take any overtime he had, not because I love overtime, but because overtime keeps your brain from replaying conversations that never led anywhere, and I understood that my future power depended on the kind of credibility that comes from showing up, clocking in, and producing clean paperwork whenever someone thinks they want to fight. By the end of the week, I had the clinic's official medication history showing nothing beyond what I had already disclosed years ago, which was exactly nothing suspicious, and I had the idea that would shift the ground under Erin without me saying her name. Because I pulled the statewide prescription monitoring report with my identity lock active, and when it came back clean, I felt the first calm breath since that kitchen scene, not because I had won anything, but because I had removed one place for the lie to live. I sent a short note to my father with the file attached, and he responded with the kind of message that tells you he read none of it, something about how this was not the point and that I needed to accept help. And I typed and deleted several sentences before landing on the only one that protected my sanity, which was I am fine and working, and I will visit when I am ready. Here is where the ground tilted, not with fireworks, but with a ping to my inbox late on a dull Tuesday when the apartment was quiet and my dinner was cooling on the counter. Because I received an automated refill confirmation from a chain pharmacy I have never used, addressed to my name and congratulating me on a ready pickup at a location a short walk from the clinic where Aaron works. And I stared at that message long enough for the room to feel smaller, while a very simple truth settled in. Which is that whoever built the lie did not expect me to lock my records or watch my alerts, and that meant they were still moving in daylight. I read the email again, noted the store address, noticed the timestamp, and realized that if I kept my mouth shut and my hands steady I could let them keep walking toward the camera while I set the frame, and I will tell you this even though it sounds cold. That I sat down at the table, opened a new folder called Receipts, printed the email, and whispered to myself that I was done arguing with people who preferred a convenient story, because I had just found the first breadcrumb that did not require their permission. When people imagine rebuilding a life after being thrown out, they picture dramatic gestures or tearful reunions, but the truth is that it was painfully boring most of the time. Because I learned very quickly that the only way to fight a lie that has been polished and repeated is to stack up quiet, undeniable pieces of paper until the weight of them crushes the story under its own nonsense. I showed up at work earlier than I had to, took every extra shift offered, and forced myself to keep my head down when coworkers asked why I looked tired, because I understood that stability was now my most powerful weapon. And while Aaron thrived on stirring emotion and getting people to react, I decided that the only response I would give her was silence and the evidence I quietly collected behind the scenes. My parents hated that silence because it robbed them of the ability to feel like they were helping, which in reality only meant keeping me inside the script Aaron had written for me, and every time I answered one of my mother's long texts with 3 flat words like, I am working, I knew it drove her mad, because she wanted the performance of shame and repentance, not the reality of me staying alive and moving forward without their approval. The system is slow, but slow does not mean useless, and I discovered that when I pulled a statewide prescription monitoring report under my locked identity, which came back clean as a whistle, confirming that no refills had ever been filed under my name at the pharmacy Aaron had so confidently pointed to. That one document alone did not prove who had actually picked up those fake bottles, but it ripped a hole in her version of the story, because if I had been what she described, there would have been a trail she could not erase, and instead the trail was empty. Still, I knew that empty records would not be enough to make my parents admit they were wrong, because they did not want facts. They wanted the simpler story, so I began to hunt for something undeniable that would not require my voice at all. That was when a friend of mine, a nurse with far more patience for bureaucracy than I had, came with me to that same pharmacy where the refill notice had originated, and we casually asked tech about account linking and pickup rules, pretending we were helping an elderly neighbor, and in her rush to be polite, the woman behind the counter admitted that someone else, a man, frequently came to pick up under my name, always showing up close to closing hours, and she even remarked that she had wondered how 2 women could have the same name but different addresses. That slip was not the smoking gun yet, but it was the first time the shadow figure of this lie stepped into focus, because the description she gave was almost word for word what Kyle, my sister's boyfriend, looked like when he ran errands in his work jacket. My stomach turned, not with surprise but with confirmation, because deep down I had already guessed it had been him, and now I knew for certain that the entire framing job had not just been Aaron's invention, but a collaboration between her and a man who had every reason to keep his own habits out of view. I printed the monitoring report, labeled the pharmacy note, witness slip, and slid them into the same folder where I had already collected my clinic records, work drug screenings, and financial statements, which by now was thick enough to feel heavy when I carried it in my bag. That weight comforted me in a strange way, because it reminded me that while I had been called a liar and a disgrace, I had the patience to turn boring documents into a wall she would never climb over. My revenge in that moment was not loud or theatrical, but strategic, because I went online and filed an official identity theft report with the local police, attaching the refill confirmation and noting that my state report showed no such prescriptions. Then I drafted a formal request for surveillance footage from the pharmacy for the dates tied to those refills. I did not name Erin in that report, because I wanted the system to circle her and Kyle naturally, and I wanted the eventual discovery to look like it had come from the rules they themselves respected, rather than a family fight. It was not glamorous, but it was precise, and I knew Erin's weakness was that she thrived on drama, but had no tolerance for silence combined with official letters, because you cannot gaslight a timestamp or argue with a camera still. I mailed the packet, kept copies in my folder, and did not tell my parents a single word, because the only thing worse than being accused falsely was being accused falsely. While looking desperate to prove innocence, and I was done feeding that cycle. Weeks later, when my friend finally called me with a trembling voice and said she had seen something that would interest me, I rushed over to her apartment and saw the first still image from that surveillance request. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking Kyle's square shoulders and careless posture as he carried a small white bag with the exact logo of the pharmacy into the parking lot, and the timestamp matched the very day a refill had been logged under my name. I stared at that photo for so long that my eyes hurt, because it was not just a picture of him running an errand. It was proof that the bag my sister had waved in front of my parents with feigned tears had not come from me, but from the man she shared her life with. The bitterness I had swallowed for months turned into something sharper, not rage but strategy, because I realized I now had something that Erin could not explain away with tone or guilt or claims of concern. For the first time since being shoved out, I felt the kind of power that does not come from speeches or tears, but from the knowledge that the truth was walking around in daylight waiting to be forced into the open. There is a very specific moment when a theory hardens into something you can hold without apologizing for it. And for me that happened the afternoon I realized the labels with my name were not just forged in a general sense, but produced through Erin's own clinic access. Because once I understood that the pharmacy bag had been carried out by Kyle and that the statewide report showed nothing tied to me, I stopped treating this as a sad family misunderstanding and started treating it like what it was, a clumsy internal fraud dressed up as sisterly concern, and the shift in my head changed everything about how I moved. I did not storm into their lives, because that would have fed the script they wrote for me, the one where I play the hysterical problem while they play the patient caregivers. So instead I sat with a friend who works in healthcare and asked the questions Erin thought I was too naive to ask, like how training labels get printed, who has access to the badge system, and whether an employee can generate sample labels for practice that look convincingly real to anyone who does not know the code stamped in the corner, and the answer was yes, which opened a door I wish I had never had to walk through. Yet I walked through it anyway, because the only way out of a lie like this is straight through the center of it. I started mapping logins the way someone else might map a neighborhood, and with a little guidance on what to look for, I learned that access logs usually carry timestamps for training environments just like patient systems do, and that while I could not see Erin's company logs myself, I could gather enough adjacent information to make a compliance officer very curious, so I pulled dates from the bogus refill emails, lined them up next to the surveillance still, and highlighted the time window. Erin had been at work according to the public clinic schedule. Then I wrote a clean, boring, neutral timeline that could have been read by anyone from human resources to a police desk sergeant without tripping over my anger. And I cannot tell you how much control it gave me to see the steps laid out in plain ink with no drama, only facts that pointed like arrows toward the only people who could have executed this with that level of confidence. I also remembered something small that suddenly mattered, which was that Erin had bragged a while back about training a new admin and complaining about how the system made her print useless practice labels that nobody ever checked, and at the time I had tuned her out, but now the memory landed like a small, heavy stone, because it meant she had both opportunity and familiarity with the kind of props that could fool our parents if waved around with enough trembling in the voice. The temptation to blow everything up in a single confrontation was real, and I will not pretend otherwise, But I had already learned that the person who wins a long game is the one who keeps the tempo slow enough to starve chaos of oxygen. So I took a quieter path that felt almost surgical in its precision, which was to print out the clean timeline, clip the surveillance still to it, and write a brief, friendly cover note to an anonymous compliance tip line at Aaron's clinic where anyone can report concerns without putting a name to the paper. I did not accuse Aaron by name. I did not mention Kyle as her boyfriend, and I did not include a single adjective that could be dismissed as emotional. Instead, I described a potential misuse of training labels linked to apparent third-party pickups at a retail pharmacy, summarized the date overlap with publicly posted staff hours, and attached the identity theft report number already on file with the local police so that whoever read it would see that this was not a family squabble, but a pattern that implicated their own internal controls. I sealed the envelope, mailed it from a post office across town, and went home to do something both small and satisfying, which was label a folder "Return to HR" in big letters and set it on my parents' coffee maker during a brief drop-in with groceries. Then forget it there on purpose, because I wanted to test whether they were still capable of curiosity outside Aaron's narrative, and I wanted them to see the existence of documentation without me delivering a speech. That little folder did more work than a shouting match ever could, because later that night my phone lit up with a call from my mother that began with formal politeness, slid into brittle worry, and then finally settled on the sentence that told me exactly who she had decided to be, which was, "Please do not make this public because it will ruin us," and I stood there listening to the way she merged her fear of neighbors with a plea for family unity, while skipping the part where her older daughter had used my name to run a petty scheme that could easily slide into criminal territory if the wrong person wanted to push it. I did not argue. I asked her one question, which was whether she had read the letters in the folder, and when she said she had skimmed them but did not understand, I told her I would be happy to explain in person, and she changed the subject, which was all I needed to hear. A few minutes later, my father called with his version of adult toughness, telling me that he was disappointed in the path I had chosen, not because he believed I was guilty anymore, I could hear that wobble in his voice, but because he understood what it would cost the family if Aaron's workplace started asking hard questions. And he wanted me to be the one who made it stop, which was a clever frame because it tried to turn my restraint into responsibility for preserving the image of the people who had thrown me out. I said one careful thing, which was that consequences are not cruelty when they follow choices, and he hung up with a sigh that sounded like a door closing in a house where I no longer lived. The next week was a study in silence and side glances, because word had clearly traveled at Aaron's clinic that some audit had been triggered, and even though I was nowhere near their halls, I could feel the heat through the way my mother sent check-in texts at strange hours, and my father forwarded me generic quotes about forgiveness, like a man tossing buckets of water toward a fire he refuses to look at directly. I kept working, kept showing up, and I kept my circle tight because I knew the moment of impact would come at an inconvenient time, and I wanted to be ready to decide without getting pulled into old patterns. And that is exactly what happened when a compliance officer called me from a blocked number to ask a series of dry questions about identity misuse reports, pickup authorizations, and whether I could confirm that I had never granted anyone the right to pick up medication under my name. I answered everything calmly, added that I had saved the automated refill emails and timestamps, and heard the click of typing on the other end as if they were fitting puzzle pieces into place, and while I cannot share every detail of that call, I can tell you that when it ended, I knew the ground under Aaron's feet had shifted from soft carpet to tile, and she would either admit the truth or slip in a way that would be impossible to style as concern. My revenge beat arrived not as applause, but as a subtle shift in posture during a brief, controlled visit to my parents' house, where I placed a small stack of groceries on the counter, asked to use the printer, and then casually printed a second clean copy of the timeline with the surveillance still, leaving it in plain sight with a yellow sticky that said "for records," because I wanted them to understand that this was no longer a question of who felt what. This was a matter of documented events that would stand whether anyone loved me or not. I left without a speech and drove back to my place with the quiet knowledge that the next moves would belong to people who had always preferred the shadows, and that my job was simply to keep the light steady, and I wish I could say that gave me peace. But what it gave me was something more useful than peace, which was control, and I held on to it with both hands, because I had a plan for the day my father would eventually text from outside my baby shower, and I needed every piece of this to be ready for that door. There comes a point when collecting evidence stops being about survival and starts becoming about deciding what kind of future you want to build. And by the time my pregnancy reached the stage where people began asking about showers and names and registries, I knew that the only way forward was to set rules so clear and so unshakable that my family would either reveal themselves through their refusal to follow them or finally admit what they had done. I was no longer interested in getting them to like me or to see me as good, because good had been twisted into whatever made Aaron's story convenient, and instead I began thinking about my child and what kind of environment I was willing to expose them to, which changed everything about how I prepared for that baby shower. Rather than planning decorations or games, I planned boundaries, and those boundaries were not decorative. They were my way of reclaiming control in a house where my voice had once been shoved into silence. I sent a single message to the family group chat that was stripped of emotion and full of rules written in simple language. If you attend the shower, you agree to no accusations, no backhanded comments, no gifts passed through other people to deliver messages. And if any of those rules are broken, you leave without debate. The message was not long, but it carried a weight that I could feel in the silence that followed, because for the first time I was not begging to be included or proving I was worthy of their presence. I was announcing conditions they had to meet to see me, and by extension to see the child they had already managed to write out of their lives before birth. Aaron's reply arrived first, a long paragraph about how I was punishing the family and creating drama, and it carried all the familiar notes of her manipulation, from fake sorrow to veiled threats about how people would perceive me. I left the message unanswered because I knew better now than to throw fuel on her fire, and silence was the one response she could not twist into another weapon. I spent my preparation energy not on flowers or playlists but on witnesses, because I had decided that if anything exploded, I would not stand alone, and so I invited two people whose presence would serve as anchors of reality. One was the nurse friend who had helped me track the pharmacy pickup, a woman with a calm voice and no tolerance for liars. And the other was my former manager who had overseen every drug-free screening and kept copies of my attendance and reliability at work. Neither of them was close enough to my family to feel pulled into our emotional gravity, but both were steady enough to speak a single factual sentence if called upon, and that was all I needed: facts, spoken in plain tones, landing on ears that had grown comfortable with fantasy. By doing this, I was not planning a fight, I was planning a shield, and it felt strange, but empowering to realize that what once made me vulnerable, my insistence on truth, was now a quiet trap I had set for those who preferred lies. Meanwhile, my mother's texts grew stranger, alternating between cold silence and hesitant questions about whether she could bring certain people, as if she were trying to sneak Aaron into the circle through back doors. My father's messages were more restrained, always talking about how he wanted peace and how important family unity was, though I could read the subtext as clearly as if he had spelled it out. Because unity was only important to him when it meant me swallowing my anger and letting their version of events stand unchallenged. I never said yes or no directly. I only referred back to the rules, repeating that anyone who came agreed to them. It was the simplest language I could use, and the lack of loopholes must have unsettled them, because a few days before the shower, my mother finally admitted they might not come, claiming that the conditions felt like punishment. I felt a stab of sadness in that moment, not because I doubted myself, but because it confirmed what I had always known deep down, which was that my parents valued the comfort of the guilty over the truth of the accused. On the morning of the shower, I moved through the motions of setting up food and stacking small favors for friends, but in my chest there was a tension that had nothing to do with balloons or cake. I knew they might not show, but I also knew my father well enough to suspect that he would find some way to appear without fully committing, because that was his pattern: halfway gestures, words about peace without the work of justice. Sure enough, as the room began to fill with coworkers and friends who had become more family to me than blood had ever managed to be, my phone buzzed with a message that made the air feel heavier. It was from my father, and it read, "We're outside. Can we meet the grandchild?" I stared at the words and felt a mix of anger and exhaustion, because even now he framed it as if the choice was mine alone, ignoring the months of silence, the fake bags of pills, the compliance tip that had already reached Aaron's workplace. He wanted to sidestep all of it with a simple text, as if showing up at the curb erased years of betrayal. I did not answer right away, because I understood that hesitation was its own kind of power, and I allowed myself to breathe through the surge of emotion before choosing my response. Instead of rushing to the door or rushing to reject him, I whispered to myself that this was exactly the moment I had been building toward, because the shower was not just a celebration of new life, but a test of old lies. And the witnesses I had invited were not there for decoration. They were there to remind me that I did not need to stand alone when the past came knocking. So I slipped the phone back into my pocket, looked around at the faces of people who knew me as steady and reliable, and made the quiet decision that I would not open that door until I was ready, until the terms were mine, and until my father and mother understood that access to me and my child would not come through half-truths or convenience ever again. I stepped outside alone because I knew that whatever happened next needed to be witnessed by me before anyone else, and as I closed the door behind me I saw my father standing on the curb holding a bouquet of flowers in one hand, while my mother sat stiffly in the passenger seat of the car and Erin slouched in the back with sunglasses that covered half her face as though hiding could erase what she had done. My father smiled the way men do when they hope charm will wipe out history, and he said softly that he wanted to meet his grandchild. But I cut him off before sentiment could take over and told him that before he set one foot inside my home, he had to give me one sentence that was true and not rehearsed. Because I had lived too long under the weight of words that only sounded good but meant nothing. He shifted on his feet, the bouquet trembling slightly, and then he admitted in a low voice that he had believed what was easiest because it kept the peace at home, and that hearing Erin cry had felt more convincing than watching me stay silent, and for the first time in my life he looked smaller to me than I had ever imagined, like a man who had chosen sleep over truth and only now realized the cost of that choice. Erin immediately jumped in from the back seat, her voice cutting through the moment like a blade, claiming that she had done what she had to do because I had been out of control, and when I calmly asked her to define what out of control meant, she stammered, searching for words that never came because she had built her entire case on smoke and theater, and I had taken away her stage. I let the silence hang, refusing to rescue her with my usual explanations, and the longer she said nothing, the more the lie sagged under its own emptiness. My mother leaned forward in the car and hissed at me not to embarrass the family in front of the neighbors, and as if on cue a woman from down the street walked past with her dog and gave us a wave, forcing my mother to smile back while her jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. That was when I realized her greatest fear had never been about my choices or Erin's lies, but about what people might whisper behind curtains, and it gave me a clarity that settled like steel in my chest. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope that I had prepared weeks ago, and I handed it to my father without ceremony. Inside were copies of the statewide prescription report, the compliance letter from Erin's clinic, the surveillance still of Kyle walking out with the white pharmacy bag, and a summary timeline that lined up every date and time with painful precision. I told my father that the price of walking through my door was not flowers, not apologies whispered privately, and not vague promises about peace, but the truth spoken aloud in front of at least one other person inside that house. And it had to be said that very day. If they could not do that, then they would not meet my child, not tomorrow, not next year, not until they understood that access to me was no longer free when bought with lies. My father opened the envelope slowly, his eyes scanning each page, his lips pressing together as he realized there was no room left for interpretation, and then he turned toward Erin and asked the question that cracked the shell wide open. Is this real? Her pause lasted too long, her jaw worked as though chewing on excuses, and in that silence the truth arrived without her consent. I gave them a choice, calm and sharp. They could leave now and try again on another day if they were brave enough, but if they wanted to walk into that house today, They had to speak the truth out loud where others would hear it, because I refused to raise a child in a home built on secrets and rewrites. My father's shoulders sagged, and then for the first time in years he looked directly at me instead of through me and said he was ready to humiliate himself if that was the price of repairing what he had broken. My mother went pale, her mouth opening to protest, but he cut her off, which almost shocked me more than his confession, and he told me to walk with him to the door. Together we stepped onto the porch, and when he crossed the threshold, he spoke loud enough for the friends and witnesses inside to hear, admitting that his daughter Erin and her boyfriend had framed me with fake pill bottles, admitting that he had believed the lie because it was easier than questioning the golden child, and admitting that he had thrown me out because convenience mattered more to him than the messy truth. The room went still. The words hung heavy in the air, and for once I felt the weight shift off my shoulders onto his where it belonged. I let him in, because he had paid the price I demanded, but when my mother moved to follow, I stopped her with a hand on the frame and gave her a smaller card I had written days earlier, 3 short sentences that said she would not manage this. She would not smooth it over, and she would not rewrite it. She read the card, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stepped back, understanding that entry for her was not automatic, it was conditional, and the condition was respect for reality instead of appearances. Erin remained in the car, refusing to get out, her silence finally an admission she could not spin. My father held the baby for the first time that afternoon, and while part of me wanted to soften, another part of me stayed sharp, because forgiveness was not the point. The point was that I had taken back control of the story, forced the truth into the light, and built a door that no one would walk through again without paying with honesty. As the evening wound down and I watched him rocking the child he had nearly lost the chance to know, I understood that I had not simply won an argument or survived a betrayal. I had rewritten the terms of what family meant to me. They could come and go in the future, but only on my rules, only when they spoke truth instead of convenience, and only when they accepted that the daughter they once discarded was no longer theirs to define. And while I know some people would ask if I forgave them, I will tell you plainly that forgiveness was never the goal. The goal was justice, emotional justice. And that was exactly what I claimed that day when I stood at my own door and made them pay the price of truth before stepping inside.